Today's video is sponsored by Underlucky Stars. Commemorate a special time in your life or the life of a loved one with a personalised star map. More on them in a bit. In this channel's short lifetime, we've covered endless men who made their mark. Men who became kings, emperors, leaders of movements that changed the course of history. But even among this pantheon, it's rare to find men or women who went one step further, who became not just a human figurehead, but the focal point of an entire religion. Well, in this episode, we're going to meet one such man, Haile Selassie. As a mere mortal, he reigned over the nation of Ethiopia for 44 transformative years. Yet his longest-lasting legacy likely has its roots over 12,000 kilometers away. In the Jamaica of the 1930s, the Rastafari religion coalesced around the idea that Selassie was not just a powerful man, but literally God. Today, an estimated 1 million followers of Rastafarianism subscribe to this belief. Yet, who was the historical figure at the center of it all, and how did he become this religion's messiah? Born in a mud hut, Haile Selassie rose through the ranks of Ethiopia's royal family to become its last emperor. As leader, he weathered coup attempts, invasion, and resistance to his progressive reforms, only to, at last, be overthrown by his own people. Powerful, tragic, and nuanced. This is the life of Haile Selassie, Africa's King of Kings. It was July the 23rd, 1892, when the boy who would become Haile Selassie was born into a life of both privilege and poverty. Poverty because his family, like nearly all 26 million of Ethiopia's inhabitants, lived in a simple mud and wattle hut within a vast rural country still wedded to the feudal system. And privilege because, unlike most Ethiopians, Selassie had the aristocratic background to escape this life. Members of the powerful Amhara tribe, Selassie's family claimed they could trace their roots all the way back to Emperor Menelik I, himself supposedly the child of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. This meant that Selassie was also related to the current Emperor Menelik II, and you better believe this conferred certain advantages. As a boy, Selassie was educated by French missionaries. His father, Ras Makonnen, was governor of Amhara. Speaking of Selassie, now might be a good time to mention names. Although he's gone down in history as Haile Selassie, the future emperor was actually born Tafari Makonnen. Like his father, he was elevated to the title of Ras or Duke. It's from the fusion of his title and name, Ras Tafari, that Rastafarianism gets its name. And while we're on the subject, we should probably also discuss Ethiopia. If you paid attention in history class, you might be under the impression that Ethiopia in this era was called Abyssinia, which it was, but only by outsiders. For this reason, we're just going to refer to it as Ethiopia throughout, just as we'll be calling Tafari Haile Selassie, even though he wouldn't take on that name until 1930. Got it? Well, great. So let's move on with today's story. When Selassie was just a teen, his father died. But while this doubtless hurt, it also took him closer than ever to the center of power. Taken in by the emperor, Selassie became part of Addis Ababa's political elite, eventually becoming promoted all the way to governor of his dad's old province. It was while working there that Selassie began to truly grasp Ethiopia's problems. While the empire was thousands of years old, the nation itself seemed like it was stuck in the Middle Ages. Dominated by a landowning nobility, Ethiopia had few roads, few large buildings, no organized healthcare, and little in the way of government infrastructure. In essence, it was a feudal society. And that was worrying. This was the heyday of colonialism, when European powers were gobbling up so much African real estate that very, very few places hadn't been absorbed into some empire or another. Selassie was quick to divine that if Ethiopia didn't modernize, it too would become little more than an exotic outpost to be exploited. But what could he do as a mere governor? Although he was related to the emperor, Selassie wasn't in line for the throne. When Menelik II died in 1913, it was the good-looking playboy Ieyasu who replaced him, not the orphan Selassie. As with his father's death, though, Selassie would soon manage to turn this latest setback into an advantage. Ieyasu had an image problem. His ancestors had been Muslim in a nation where the elite were all Christian. So, when he started making moves to desecularize society, those same elites didn't see a serious attempt to improve the lot of Ethiopia's religious minorities, but rather a diabolical plot to make them all worship Allah and stop drinking their beloved Tej. As head of the Christian opposition, Selassie led the charge in accusing Ieyasu of being an apostate, a traitor, and generally just a giant douchebag. When in 1916 Ieyasu also started making overtures to World War I Central Powers, It was the last straw. Iyasu was overthrown that September, replaced with Menelik's daughter, Zuditu. But since the idea of female ruler was almost as bad to these guys as an Islamic emperor, it was decided Zuditu needed a regent, someone who could give her reign a shot of testosterone. Care to guess who they chose? In early 1917, Selassie was appointed Zuditu's crown prince and heir apparent. And so began his unstoppable rise to power. In many ways, the pairing of Selassie and Zuditu was an odd one. While Selassie was aligned with Ethiopia's progressives, Zuditu was so conservative that she'd make Mitch McConnell look like a jowly Che Guevara. Yet there was something both Empress and Crown Prince had in common. They were both capable of being staggeringly ruthless. It was often said that Selassie crept like a mouse, but had the jaws of a lion, and those jaws started snapping shut even before he became heir apparent. In the battle against Iyasu's forces, Selassie was merciless. Superior firepower and executions were deployed to solidify his grip on power. It was brutal, but it worked. Ethiopia failed to spiral into the predictable chaos. Combined with the destruction of Iyasu's army in summer 1917, a larger crisis was averted. And so the Crown Prince was at last free to pursue his long-desired reforms. As the 1920s dawned, it was on an Ethiopia in the grip of furious change. Under Selassie's orders, new schools were being opened, designed to educate the children of the elite along European lines. A professional civil service and bureaucracy was beginning to be brought in, taking power out of the hands of the feudal overlords. The first moves were even being made on the abolition of slavery, although it would be decades before a full-scale ban was implemented. Arguably, though, the most important changes were in Ethiopia's international relations. In 1923, Selassie took his country into the League of Nations, a kind of precursor to the UN, with added uselessness. To Selassie, though, the League's collective security seemed to guarantee Ethiopia's safety from colonial powers, as did his burgeoning friendship with those same powers. In 1924, he became Ethiopia's first ruler to make an international trip, traveling through Europe's great capitals and schmoozing everybody. While the stated reason for buttering up the Europeans was to encourage investment in private, Selassie was more direct, saying, "We need European progress only because we are surrounded by it." In other words, keep the mad colonizers at bay by letting them invest in Ethiopia's booming markets. And in the 1920s, those markets were really booming. With coffee selling spectacularly, more money was being freed up to construct roads and communication lines, while a new class of entrepreneurs was starting to emerge. It was, in short, a good era for progress, but not everybody was happy. In the palace, Zuditu and her conservative allies were stewing at the reforms upending their nation. From their perspective, Selassie's improvements were more like unforgivable decadence, the beginning of Ethiopia's slide into ignominy. So, in 1928, they decided to get rid of him, only to find themselves stepping right into those lions' jaws. The September 1928 coup was such a failure that Zuditu's limited authority collapsed. In the aftermath, she was forced to proclaim Selassie Negus, or king. But this title would only be a stepping stone. A year and a half after the coup, in the spring of 1930, Zuditu was found dead, apparently of complications relating to diabetes. With that, Selassie's takeover was complete. On November 2nd, 1930, the man who had been born Tafari Makonnen was crowned Ethiopia's 225th emperor. It's at this point that he took the name Haile Selassie, meaning Might of the Trinity, amid a lavish coronation ceremony. Held in Addis Ababa, Selassie's coronation was eye-wateringly expensive, involving all manner of spectacular uniforms and sumptuous decorations. Although the European press, including the novelist Evelyn Waugh, ridiculed it, they were missing the point. Selassie wanted to project a vision of Ethiopia with as much pomp and regalia as anything in Europe, a state that wasn't a potential colony, but an equal to anywhere where white men ruled. 8 months after taking power, he set out his new vision for this Ethiopia in writing. The 1931 constitution placed Selassie at the center of everything, a paternal ruler who always knew what was best for his people and could never be opposed. From now on, the King of Kings would rule as an absolute monarch. Alright, so we'll get back to today's video in just a second, but first, quick word from our brand new video sponsor, Underlucky Stars. Underlucky Stars make beautiful, personalized star maps that show the unique alignment of the stars in a place and time chosen by you. This is the original map maker for stars with a proprietary method of mapping the stars in the universe, verified by astrophysicists from NASA, so you know you're getting the real deal. How does it work? Well, all you have to do is enter the location, date, and time of a special moment in your life that you'd like to commemorate, and Underlucky Stars can show you exactly how the sky looked at that time with a beautiful map printed on museum quality thick matte art paper. There are more than 15 designs and 6 border options to choose from, which means you can create a totally personalized memento. I've got mine right here. It's so big, it's a big reflection of my light. But it's not going to fit in the frame, right? But this is a beautiful one. It's actually when my wife and I got married, so I got her that as a gift for Valentine's Day. And you might be thinking, well, Valentine's Day is coming up, and you haven't got anything for the loved one in your life. This is a perfect gift. It's thoughtful, it's just nice. Right now, you guys can take advantage of an exclusive 10% discount this Valentine's Day. Head to underluckystars.com/biographics and use code biographics to get your loved one a gift they'll never forget. And now back to today's video. The first 4 years of Selassie's reign can only be called benign despotism. The emperor used his sweeping powers to drag Ethiopia into the modern age, establishing schools, building hospitals and roads, and instituting a police force. The result certainly wasn't a democratic paradise. Civic participation was almost non-existent, and the idea of anything as radical as a separation of powers was little more than a grim joke. Still, for all Selassie might have held the nation in an iron grip, it was at least one wrapped in a velvet glove, his autocratic tendencies softened by real improvements. The next power to take over the country, by contrast, would dispense with softness entirely. On the borders of Ethiopia, in Eritrea and modern-day Somalia, a fascist power was looking to expand. Benito Mussolini's dream was to establish an East African empire, one that would include all of Selassie's nation. Of course, as a member of the League of Nations, Ethiopia was supposedly covered by its joint security agreement, but Mussolini was willing to bet that the League was even more toothless than it seemed. In this, he would be proved depressingly right. Tensions started to climb in November 1934 when Ethiopian and Italian troops got caught in a series of skirmishes near the border of Italian Somaliland. This was followed by a massive build-up on the Italian side as Il Duce began preparing for war. But Selassie still believed membership of the League would save him. Rather than mobilize, he asked the League to adjudicate on the border dispute. He was still waiting for an answer when the invasion began. Opening on October 2nd, 1935, the Italo-Ethiopian War was short, it was grim, and it was humiliating. As Mussolini publicly declared he was on a mission to bring progress to this backwards nation, his troops unleashed chemical weapons while Italian planes dropped bombs on civilian populations. As one correspondent observed, this isn't a war. It isn't even a slaughter. It's the torture of tens of thousands of men, women, and children with bombs and poison gas. In the face of such dirty tactics, what hope did the Ethiopians have? On May 2nd, 1936, Haile Selassie boarded his imperial train and was taken away into exile. 3 days later, Addis Ababa fell. As Ethiopia crumbled, some of the Italian commanders suggested that they bomb Selassie's train, but Mussolini demurred. With a victory so complete, the fascist leader could afford to be magnanimous. 7 months after they first crossed the border, the Italians had triumphed. One of the only African states to avoid being colonized was now absorbed into the colony of Italian East Africa. Yet Selassie still clung to the hope that help might be coming. On the 20th of June, the 150-centimetre tall, that's 5'4" emperor stood at a podium before the League of Nations in Geneva. As fascist observers booed, he made a dignified speech laying out why the League needed to act, how Italy had broken international law, the grave consequence of inaction. Famously, he ended with the prophetic phrase, "It is us today, it will be you tomorrow." At the end of Selassie's speech, the delegates applauded. Then they voted to take no action, while the most powerful nations, France and Britain, cut separate deals with Mussolini. And so the most iconic moment in Selassie's life ended not with diplomatic triumph, but with the penniless emperor exiled to the British city of Bath, unable to even afford new books to read. But of course, this wasn't the end of Haile Selassie. Just over 4 years after his League of Nations speech, Italy invaded the protectorate of British Somaliland, bringing World War II to East Africa. Sadly for Il Duce, it was the dumbest thing he could have done. In response, Winston Churchill called Selassie out of retirement, gave him the codename Mr. Strong, and flew him secretly to Khartoum with a simple goal: train up an army of resistance, invade Italy's colonies, and kick Mussolini out on his pudgy arse. It was a plan the King of Kings would carry out with extreme prejudice. When Selassie fled the oncoming storm in 1936, he'd been attacked for abandoning the people. The Great Coward is how firebrand Jamaican activist Marcus Garvey referred to him. But there was nothing cowardly about the Emperor's return. With Ethiopia now recognized as one of the Allies, the army of resistance marched on Mussolini's empire in January 1941. From a brutal occupying force, the Italians became mere paper soldiers, crumpling up and blowing away in the face of serious opposition. On May the 5th, exactly 5 years after Addis Ababa fell, Italian control of Ethiopia collapsed. That day, Haile Selassie re-entered the capital in an Alfa Romeo. As the emperor stepped out onto the hot streets, he was greeted with a telegram from Churchill. "It is with deep pleasure that the British nation and empire have learned of your Imperial Majesty's welcome home." Not that a free Ethiopia was immediately re-established. For the rest of 1941, the country was under British administration. There's some speculation London considered remaining in control longer, but Selassie was impatient to re-establish his authority. In January 1942, the British officially recognized an independent Ethiopia. Not long after, Selassie finally did what international supporters had been hoping he'd do for years. He fully abolished slavery. A long-standing form of punishment, slavery had been so entrenched in the nation that even nominally anti-slavery emperors like Menelik II had owned hundreds of slaves. Even Selassie himself is thought to have been a slave owner. Nonetheless, it was by his decree that the practice was finally ended, part of a second wave of modernization planned for his nation. But first, the emperor wanted that nation to expand. For decades, Ethiopia's north had been cut off from the ocean by the Italian colony of Eritrea. With Italy now defeated, Selassie approached President Roosevelt in February 1945 with a request that Eritrea be handed to him after the war. At first, Uncle Sam simply promised to think about it, but as the hot war ended and the Cold War began, it became clear that an American-friendly port on the Red Sea could be extremely darn useful. In 1949, a joint UN Allied Powers report declared Eritrea was incapable of sustaining itself as an independent nation. 3 years later, it was joined in a federation with Ethiopia. Selassie's first major geopolitical win in this new world order. And this was an order the emperor wholeheartedly embraced. Despite his disappointments with his forerunner, Selassie took Ethiopia into the United Nations, even sending troops to help during the Korean War. At the same time, his restored nation was plugging itself into world markets, inviting in Western teachers to educate the populace. The rise of this dynamic new Ethiopia culminated in 1955 with a brand new transformative constitution. For the first time, an educated lower house would be formed with lawmaking powers. The judiciary would be independent, the bureaucracy overhauled and made to serve the people. The franchise was extended to every citizen. For the first time, citizens' rights were codified. Yet, for all of its progressive-sounding clauses, the 1955 Constitution didn't create a democratic utopia. Buried amid the text, but permeating every line, were sections designed to do nothing but shore up Selassie's power, to make sure no one could so much as question him. Selassie wanted a bright, shiny new future for Ethiopia, all right, but only if he was eternally at its very top. It would be this ambition that would turn the final act of his remarkable life into such an avoidable tragedy. So far in this video, we focused on the story of Haile Selassie, the man, the mortal human who became Ethiopia's emperor. But there's another story playing out there in the background, taking place at roughly the same time. The story of how Haile Selassie came to be revered as a god. Unlike our main story, this version of Selassie's tale begins in 1916, when Marcus Garvey announced to his followers, "Look to Africa for the crowning of a black king. He shall be the Redeemer." At the time, of course, Africa was mostly a patchwork of European colonies. A truly independent black king wasn't something that came along very often at all. So when Haile Selassie was crowned at a grand ceremony in 1930, it felt to many among Jamaica's poor and disenfranchised that Garvey's prophecy had come true. Over the following years, the religious teaching that Selassie was Jah incarnate began to spread over the island. Taking its name from his old title and birth name, Rastafarianism would become one of the Caribbean's great social movements, a movement turbocharged by the Italian invasion. Playing into Rastafarian concepts about Babylon, in this case colonial society, oppressing black people, the invasion became a rallying cry. When Selassie retook the throne, it only confirmed that he was the prophesied Black Messiah. This elevation in Rasta thought soon got caught up in other cultural currents swirling through Jamaica. After denouncing Selassie as a coward, Garvey changed his mind and started making Ethiopia a focal point of his Back to Africa movement. This, in turn, influenced Rastafaris until Selassie's kingdom came to be seen as the promised land of Zion. It probably helped that after World War II, Selassie had established a land grant around Shasamani village that black people from the Americas could settle in. Initially intended for those from the USA, it soon became a focal point of a minor wave of Rastafari immigration. Finally, in 1966, the Emperor made a state visit to Jamaica, touching down in Kingston on April the 21st. So many Rastas swarmed the airport that they took over the runway, turning a working transport hub into an impromptu religious carnival. For Rastafarians, Selassie's arrival in Jamaica was effectively his second coming. To this day, April the 21st is still celebrated as Grounation Day, the day Jah walked among the ordinary men of Kingston. Yet even as Rastafarians abroad were deifying him, back home, Selassie's reign was beginning to lose its shine. The trouble was, all those young elites Selassie had encouraged into his new schools were now adults with enough education to question why they were still ruled by an autocrat. It didn't help that Selassie responded to a failed coup by forming a new government composed of the aristocracy and military elites. The impression was of an emperor no longer taking his nation forward, but rather holding it back, especially when you looked to Eritrea. In 1962, Ethiopia had dissolved its federation with its northern neighbor in favor of outright annexation. This had led to an insurgency erupting that tied up the army and brought in a constant flood of bad news. It was about to get even worse. As the 1960s rolled on, other ethnicities within Ethiopia's patchwork of peoples would begin to stage their own revolts. He may have just been recognized as the living incarnation of God, but the mortal man who was Haile Selassie would soon have a much bigger problem, making sure that living was exactly what he continued to do. By the close of the 1960s, it was clear Ethiopia was in trouble. In the cities, socialist-inspired students were agitating for land reform. As their Leninist doctrine spread, so did the idea that ethnicities should have the right to secede, a right many disaffected groups eagerly grasped. Soon uprisings were springing up alongside the conflict in Eritrea. Gojam erupted, as did Sidamo and Tigray. But it was in Wollo that the match would be lit on the pile of resentful dynamite now underlying society. In 1971, a terrible drought struck Ethiopia, laying waste to the countryside. That year, food stocks had to be eaten to supplement the terrible harvest. When drought again hit the following year, even the seeds and the grain was consumed. All of this led to an inevitable and horrific outcome in 1973. Famine. Today, it's unknown exactly how many died in the Wollo famine, although estimates place it as around 200,000 people. But the real problem was Selassie's reaction. Rather than beg the international community for help, the emperor tried to hide what was happening, even throwing sumptuous banquets to cover up the food scarcity. So when the news finally broke, it made the emperor not just look callous, but actively cruel. And that tipped the scales from "we need reform" to "that has to go." In June 1974, following 6 months of strikes, rioting and chaos, a bunch of military officials and self-proclaimed socialists formed a committee known as the Derg. On September the 12th, they overthrew Selassie in a coup, dragging him from his palace as crowds jeered and shouted insults. Initially, the Derg wanted to place Selassie's son on the throne, but when Crown Prince Asfor refused to go along with them, the Derg were all like, "Alright, fine, I guess we'll just rule by ourselves then." The announcement of a communist state on December the 20th effectively ended the Ethiopian monarchy after 3,000 years. In its place came a military junta that would take Ethiopia into a series of wars and famine, far more terrible than anything that happened on Selassie's watch. But the last emperor wouldn't be around to see it. On August the 27th, 1975, the Derg tersely announced that Selassie had died of natural causes. While that's not impossible for a man of 83, many still believe he was murdered, especially given his final resting place. After the fall of the Derg in 1992, Selassie's bones were found entombed in concrete beneath the private toilet of the Derg's leader, Colonel Mengistu. It would take until November 2000 for his relatives to finally receive an official reburial. Today, as when the emperor was alive, there exist two Haile Selassies. One is the Selassie of Rasta thought, a black spiritual leader that 1 million people worship and millions more have heard about. This Selassie is an icon, not just for his role in Rastafarianism, but for being a powerful African leader at a time when most of Africa was subjugated. But there's also another Selassie, one who started out as a reformer only to wind up being consumed by his inability to reform as fast as his people needed. This Selassie is all too human, a remarkable man, but still just a man, and one who, sadly, ended his reign not beloved, but driven from power. Whichever Selassie you believe in, though, there's no doubting his historical significance. As the last emperor of Ethiopia, Selassie guided one of Africa's most important countries through an era of bloodshed and change that effectively turned a medieval society into a modern state. He may not have been perfect, his improvements may have been broadly undone by the Derg's bloody rule, but he still was a transformative leader, one whose name will echo throughout history.